When Irene Mayer married David O. Selznick in the spring of 1930, it was more than just a wedding. It was a coronation. A new royal court was established, and Irene, at the tender age of 23, ascended to the role she had been groomed for her entire life. She became the undisputed queen of Hollywood society. Their first home on the prestigious Roxbury Drive, and later their sprawling colonial revival mansion at 1050 Summit Drive in Beverly Hills, instantly eclipsed all other social centers, including the once fabled Pick Fair. To receive an invitation to a Selznick dinner party was the ultimate validation in a town built on status. It meant you were not just a star, you were a power player. Irene, with the meticulous planning of a field marshal and the understated grace of a diplomat, orchestrated these evenings to perfection. These were not the raucous, gin-soaked parties common in the industry. A Selznick party was a carefully curated salon, a masterpiece of social chemistry. Irene had an almost psychic gift for it. She knew who to seat next to whom, who would spark a brilliant conversation, who would forge a powerful new alliance. Her guest lists were a breathtaking fusion of creative genius and immense power. One evening, you might find the reclusive Greta Garbo engaged in a rare animated conversation with the visiting Duke of Windsor, while Katharine Hepburn traded witty barbs with the composer Cole Porter. And a nervous young writer found himself deep in conversation with a studio head who could make or break his career. She was the ultimate hostess because she was the ultimate insider. She understood the intricate web of rivalries, ambitions, and insecurities that defined her world. She knew how to soothe the massive, fragile ego of a top director, how to gently extract information from a rival producer, and how to create an atmosphere where business could be conducted under the elegant guise of a social gathering. Many of the great deals and legendary film collaborations of Hollywood's golden age were born not in a boardroom, but over cocktails on Irene's perfectly manicured lawn. She wielded a quiet, immense power from her dinner table, a power that was all the more effective for being so subtle, so elegantly disguised as mere hospitality. But her true influence, the work that would define the next 15 years of her life, took place long after the last guest had departed. While the world saw her as the flawless hostess and the glamorous wife of a brilliant producer, her real job started when the doors were closed. She was the secret weapon of David O. Selznick. She was his co-producer, his story editor, his most trusted advisor, and his harshest critic. She was the calm, analytical mind that provided the ballast for his creative hurricane. David Selznick was a man who lived and breathed movies. His energy was legendary, and it was often chaotic. He was famous for his all-night story conferences and his obsessive stream of consciousness memos that could run for dozens of single-space pages. He was a fountain of ideas, some brilliant, some terrible, and Irene was his filter. Every night he would come home, his mind racing, his pockets stuffed with scripts, notes, and the daily reports from the studio. And she would listen, she would read, she would analyze. In her typically modest autobiography, A Private View, she is careful to downplay her contributions. But David himself and everyone in their inner circle knew the truth. He called her the best man in my organization and admitted, her judgment is the soundest I know. She possessed an impeccable sense of story structure, a deep understanding of character, and an almost infallible gauge of public taste. But most importantly, as she herself later said, I was the only person he could trust to tell him the truth. In a world of sycophants, she was the one voice who would tell the boy genius when his ideas were simply not good enough. Her invisible hand shaped his entire career. When David, in a bold move, left the protective shadow of his father-in-law at MGM to become head of production at the struggling RKO Pictures, it was Irene who supported the gamble. While he was at RKO, he produced classics like What Price Hollywood and the groundbreaking King Kong. And it was Irene who read the scripts, who sat through the screenings, who advised him on which projects to champion and which to avoid. When he finally achieved his dream in 1935 and formed his own independent studio, Selznick International Pictures, her role became even more crucial. He was no longer just a producer. He was a mogul, betting his own money and often the bank's on his vision. The stakes were astronomical and the pressure was immense. Irene became the bedrock of the entire operation. From their home on Summit Drive, which David called the Annex, she functioned as the studio's unofficial head of story development. Her notes on scripts were legendary among the writers who worked for Selznick. They were sharp, unsentimental, and almost always right. She had a particular genius for identifying a story's emotional core and stripping away everything that was superfluous. On the 1937 classic A Star is Born, it was Irene who helped shape the final heartbreaking scenes, ensuring that the film's emotional punch was not diluted by sentimentality. On Alfred Hitchcock's first American film, Rebecca, which Selznick produced, she worked tirelessly with the writers to preserve the gothic, psychological suspense of Daphne du Maurier's novel, fighting against instincts to make it a more conventional romance. But her greatest, most monumental, and most completely uncredited collaboration was on the film that would become David's obsession, his masterpiece, and the crowning achievement of their partnership, Gone with the Wind. The making of Gone with the Wind is one of the great epics of film history. From the moment David Selznick bought the rights to Margaret Mitchell's blockbuster novel in 1936, the project consumed his life and, by extension, Irene's. For over 3 years, it was a creative and logistical maelstrom that threatened to bankrupt the studio and drive everyone involved to the brink of insanity. David was determined to create a film that was not just a movie, but a national event, a work of art that would be as epic and as enduring as the novel itself. His obsession was total, and through it all, Irene was his co-conspirator. The production was a chaotic whirlwind of fired directors, endless script rewrites, and casting dramas. The search for an actress to play Scarlett O'Hara became an international publicity sensation. Every major star in Hollywood coveted the role, from Bette Davis to Katharine Hepburn. David screen-tested dozens of them, but none seemed quite right. It was Irene, with her cool judgment, who kept insisting that Scarlett required a unique combination of qualities: strength, beauty, vulnerability, and a core of steel that the established stars didn't quite possess. She was one of the earliest and most steadfast champions of a little-known British actress named Vivien Leigh, whose electrifying screen test, arranged by David's brother Myron, finally won her the part. The writing of the screenplay was a legendary ordeal that the writers involved later referred to as the Baton Death March. David hired and fired a succession of the best writers in Hollywood, including the novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald. He would lock them in rooms, feeding them bananas and peanuts, forcing them to churn out pages, which he would then rewrite himself in a benzedrine-fueled frenzy. Every night he would bring the pages home to Irene. She was the one who had to read the chaotic, contradictory drafts and help him find the through line, the one who had to remind him of the emotional core of the story amidst the epic sweep of historical events. She was also the studio's unofficial diplomat. When David's explosive temper and obsessive demands alienated his staff, his directors, or his financial backers, it was often Irene who, with a quiet phone call or a charming dinner party, smoothed the ruffled feathers and kept the fragile production from collapsing. She was the steady hand on the tiller of a ship that was constantly threatening to run aground. Even her literary taste left its mark on the final film. She felt that the epic nature of the story needed a certain historical gravity. It was her idea to add the formal literary-style title cards that punctuate the film, writing many of them herself to give the movie the feel of a great historical novel. When Gone with the Wind finally premiered in Atlanta in December 1939, it was the biggest cultural event of the decade. The film was a staggering, unprecedented success, breaking every box office record and winning 10 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. It was the absolute vindication of David's obsessive, mad vision. It was his name on the producer's credit, his Oscar on the mantelpiece. But in every sense of the word, it was her triumph too. She had been the secret architect of the most beloved film of all time. At the pinnacle of this incredible success, they should have been the happiest, most powerful couple in the world. But the same obsessive demons that had fueled David's masterpiece were now beginning to consume their marriage. Behind the magnificent facade of their Summit Drive mansion, the private world of the Selznicks was beginning to crumble. David's obsessive nature was not something he could turn off when a film was finished. It was the very fabric of his being, and it was deeply entwined with his addictions. His gambling, which had always been a problem, escalated to terrifying new levels. Gin rummy was his game of choice, and he would play for stakes that were astronomically high, even for Hollywood. His regular opponents were a cabal of the industry's most powerful moguls and producers, men like Joseph Schenck and Sam Goldwyn. These were not friendly games. They were brutal psychological battles, and David often lost. Irene would later write of the dread she felt when he would go off to one of these games, the terror of waiting for the late-night phone call, where a strained voice would inform her that David had lost 50 or 100 or even $200,000 in a single evening. It was a fortune, and it created a constant state of financial and emotional chaos in their lives. He would plunge into a deep, remorseful depression, followed by a new, manic burst of work. Another film project initiated not out of passion, but out of a desperate need to cover his debts. To fuel these manic bursts of work, his reliance on Benzedrine and amphetamine became more and more pronounced. He would stay awake for days at a time, dictating his endless memos, his mind racing faster and faster. The drug exacerbated his paranoia and his volatile temper. To come down from the amphetamine highs, he would then take powerful sedatives, creating a vicious, destructive cycle of chemical highs and lows. Irene was living with a man who was perpetually on the edge of a nervous and financial breakdown. She tried to intervene, pleading with his friends, his doctors, his brother Myron. But David was a force of nature, a man who refused to believe he had a problem. Irene, the ultimate controller, was trapped in a life that was spiraling completely out of control. She tolerated his casual infidelities, viewing them as a sad but not fatal symptom of his chaotic personality and the permissive culture of Hollywood. She saw it as her duty to her two sons, Jeffrey and Daniel, and to the ideal of the family, to hold their world together. She was the daughter of L.B. Mayer, after all, and Mayers did not fail. But in 1941, David would begin a new relationship, an obsession that was different from all the others, a betrayal so profound it would eventually shatter the foundations of their marriage and Irene's entire world. He discovered a young, unknown actress from Oklahoma named Phyllis Isley. She was beautiful, talented, and possessed a kind of ethereal spiritual quality that he found mesmerizing. He signed her to a personal contract and took complete dictatorial control of her life and career. He began by changing her name. Phyllis Isley, he decided, was too plain. He would rename her Jennifer Jones. He then set about the task of molding her, creating her, turning her into the great actress he knew she could be. It was a Pygmalion-like obsession, and it quickly became personal. The professional relationship bled into a passionate, all-consuming love affair. This was not just another dalliance. For David, Jennifer was his new masterpiece, a creation even more perfect than Gone with the Wind. And for Irene, she was the ultimate betrayal. The creative and emotional partnership that had been the bedrock of her marriage, the one thing she thought was truly hers, was now being given to another woman. When we left the Selznicks, they were standing at the pinnacle of their professional lives, the creators of Gone with the Wind, the undisputed king and queen of Hollywood. But the private foundations of their kingdom were rotting away, undermined by David's addictions and his burgeoning obsession with a young actress named Jennifer Jones. For Irene, this was more than just another infidelity. It was a fundamental betrayal of the creative partnership that had been the very soul of their marriage. The secret weapon had been cast aside, and the next few years would become a long, agonizing masterclass in public humiliation and private heartbreak. David Selznick's affair with Jennifer Jones was not a sordid backstreet liaison. That would have been too simple, too common. David's obsessions were never small. He conducted his relationship with Jennifer under the full glare of the Hollywood spotlight, cloaking it in the respectable guise of a producer crafting his greatest star. He poured the full force of his genius, his time, and, most painfully for Irene, their money, into her career. He was determined to make her not just a star, but an icon, a project that consumed him with a fervor that even surpassed his work on Gone with the Wind. For Irene, this was a unique and exquisite form of torture. She was forced to live inside her husband's new passion project. Jennifer Jones was a constant presence in their lives. Her screen tests were viewed in their private projection room. Her costume fittings were discussed over their dinner table. Her career strategy was the subject of David's endless late-night monologues. Irene, the brilliant story analyst, was now expected to offer her professional opinion on the daily rushes of the woman who was sleeping with her husband. It was a surreal and breathtakingly cruel situation, demanding a level of composure that would have broken a lesser woman. She had to maintain the facade. The Selznick dinner parties continued, the perfect hostess still reigning over her court. But now, Jennifer Jones was sometimes a guest, her presence a silent, screaming testament to Irene's humiliation. Hollywood, a town that ran on gossip, watched with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. They saw Irene's dramatic weight loss, the new hard-won lines of pain around her eyes, and the icy, impeccable poise that became her armor. She was playing the most difficult role of her life, the supportive, dignified wife of a man who was publicly dismantling their marriage. The centerpiece of David's obsession and the source of Irene's greatest pain was the 1943 film, The Song of Bernadette. It was a lavish, prestigious production, a story of faith and miracles, and it was designed with one single-minded purpose: to win Jennifer Jones an Academy Award. David drove the production with a maniacal intensity. Nothing was too good, no expense too great for his protégé. Irene watched from the sidelines as he poured the same energy, the same perfectionism, the same genius that he had once dedicated to their shared dreams into this monument to his new love. The film was a resounding critical and commercial success, and Jennifer Jones, in a performance of luminous grace, was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress. The night of the Academy Awards was the apotheosis of Irene's agony. She was, of course, expected to be there, seated beside her husband. She had to watch as the Hollywood community celebrated the triumph of her rival. And when the winner for Best Actress was announced, the name called was Jennifer Jones. The young actress, on her 25th birthday, walked to the stage to accept her Oscar, a star created, polished, and delivered by David O. Selznick. In her speech, she tearfully thanked her director, her co-stars, and then, looking out into the audience, she thanked David, her voice thick with emotion, for his artistic guidance and inspiration. For Irene, sitting in the dark, surrounded by the applause, it must have felt like a public execution. This moment should have been a triumph for her as well. She, more than anyone, understood the work that had gone into that performance, the obsessive drive that had propelled it to this victory. But she was now an outsider, a spectator at the coronation of the new queen. The Oscar was not just a statue, it was a golden, glittering symbol of everything she had lost. It was the moment the private affair became a public, award-winning fact. So why did she stay? Why did she endure the humiliation for so long? The answer is a complex tapestry of love, duty, and fear. She still loved David, or at least she loved the brilliant, charming, and vulnerable man he had once been, the man she could still occasionally glimpse beneath the layers of addiction and obsession. She was fiercely loyal, and the idea of abandoning him to his demons felt like a betrayal of the vows she had taken so seriously. Then there was her profound sense of duty to her two sons, Jeffrey and Daniel. She was determined to provide them with a stable home, to protect them from the chaos of their father's life and the ugliness of a public scandal. The Selznick name was a dynasty, and she saw herself as its guardian. Divorce was not just a personal failure, it was a failure of the dynasty itself. And finally, there was the immense suffocating influence of her own father. Louis B. Mayer's reaction to the affair was predictably volcanic. He was a man for whom loyalty was everything, and in his eyes, David Selznick was an ungrateful traitor. He had plucked David from obscurity, made him a star producer, and given him his most precious possession, his daughter. And this was how he was repaid? With public humiliation? L.B. Mayer's fury was biblical. He and David, who had once been like father and son, became bitter enemies. Their confrontations were the stuff of Hollywood legend. Mayer would summon David to his office at MGM for screaming matches that could be heard down the hall, berating him for his gambling, his disloyalty, and his treatment of Irene. He would then call Irene, urging her to leave the man who was dishonoring her. He promised her anything, money, security, a home back under his protection, but his support was a double-edged sword. Mayer's solution was for his daughter to come home, to retreat back under the patriarchal umbrella of his control. He wanted to save her, but on his own terms. He could not understand her need for her own life, her own identity. For Irene, escaping the gilded cage of her marriage only to fly back into the more familiar, but equally confining cage of her father's house was not freedom. It was simply trading one form of dependency for another. She was trapped between a husband who wouldn't let her go and a father who wouldn't let her be free. This period, from 1941 to 1945, was Irene's crucible. The psychological and emotional toll was immense. A friend who knew her then described her as a ghost at her own parties, a woman who moved with a kind of brittle, flawless grace, her smile a masterpiece of social discipline, her eyes revealing nothing. She retreated into a shell of impeccable, icy poise, a defense mechanism against a world that was watching her every move. Her own words, written decades later in her autobiography, provide the most heartbreaking insight into her state of mind. She describes the long, sleepless nights, the dread of the ringing telephone, the constant gnawing anxiety. It was during one of these nights, after a particularly vicious argument with David, that she had her moment of terrible clarity. She lay in the dark in her magnificent bedroom, a room she had decorated to perfection, and began to mentally catalog every beautiful object it contained. The French antiques, the custom woven carpets, the priceless paintings on the walls. It was an attempt to anchor herself in the beautiful, orderly world she had created. And then the thought came, stark and unbidden. My life was a masterpiece of decor, but the inhabitants were missing. It was the breaking point. It was the recognition that the perfect house was empty, that the perfect marriage was a sham, and that the perfect wife was a role she could no longer play. It was the moment she realized that her own survival depended on an act of radical, terrifying rebellion. She had to leave. The decision, when she finally made it in 1945, was not an act of passion or anger. It was a cold, calculated act of self-preservation. She had endured the affair, the gambling, the drugs, the lies. But the final straw was the realization that the man she had married, the brilliant, passionate collaborator, was gone forever, replaced by an addict in the grip of an obsession he could not or would not control. She had spent years trying to save him. Now she had to save herself. The news that Irene Mayer Selznick was filing for divorce was a Hollywood earthquake. It was the official, public death of the town's greatest dynasty. It was an act of lèse-majesté, a princess walking out on the king. It was a move of such breathtaking courage that it sent shock waves through the entire industry. This wasn't just a breakup, it was the end of an era. The legal proceedings were long and complicated, dragging on for 3 years before the divorce was finalized in 1948. But for Irene, the decision itself was the liberation. She could have stayed in California. She could have remained a powerful figure in Hollywood society, a wealthy and respected divorcee. But that would have meant living forever in the shadow of the past, forever being defined as the former Mrs. Selznick. She needed a clean break. She needed a new world, a new stage, a new life that had no connection to the one she was leaving behind. So she did the most radical thing she could imagine. She sold the magnificent house on Summit Drive, she packed her books and her paintings, and she bought a one-way ticket to New York City. She was leaving the kingdom of dreams, the only world she had ever known. She was stepping out of the shadow of her husband and out of the suffocating embrace of her father. She was walking away from her titles as princess and queen. She was 38 years old, and for the first time in her life, she was completely, terrifyingly, and gloriously on her own. She wasn't just fleeing a failed marriage, she was advancing into a new life, a life where she would finally be the protagonist of her own story. When we last saw Irene Mayer Selznick, she was walking away from a kingdom. She had abdicated her throne as the Queen of Hollywood, leaving behind the wreckage of her marriage to David O. Selznick and the suffocating influence of her father, Louis B. Mayer. She was 38 years old, armed with a substantial divorce settlement, a formidable intelligence, and a lifetime of insider knowledge. She had boarded a train and headed east, not in defeat, but with the quiet, steely resolve of a general advancing into new territory. Her destination was New York City, and her goal was nothing short of a complete and total reinvention. The New York she arrived in was the undisputed capital of the post-war world. It was a city crackling with intellectual energy, artistic innovation, and a sense of limitless possibility. It was everything Hollywood was not. Where Hollywood was an insular company town built on image and illusion, New York was a sprawling, anonymous metropolis built on substance, ambition, and a brutally high standard of excellence. Where Hollywood power was concentrated in the hands of a few studio patriarchs, New York power was more diffuse, spread across the worlds of finance, publishing, art, and, most importantly for Irene, the legitimate theater. Broadway was the pinnacle of American entertainment, a place where the written word was sacred and the actor's craft was revered. For Irene, a lifelong passionate reader, it was a spiritual homecoming. She didn't buy a townhouse or a penthouse. Instead, she established her new court in a magnificent multi-room suite on the 28th floor of the Pierre Hotel, a grand residential hotel on the corner of 5th Avenue and 61st Street. Her windows looked out over the vast green expanse of Central Park. It was a fortress of elegance and solitude, a command center from which she would plan her second act. She had left the sprawling horizontal kingdom of Beverly Hills for a new vertical kingdom in the sky. But her entry into the world she had chosen was far from a royal welcome. The New York theatrical establishment was a notoriously closed and snobbish circle. They looked down their noses at what they considered the crass, commercial, and artistically bankrupt world of Hollywood. And Irene, with her famous name and her well-publicized past, was seen as the ultimate symbol of that world. The reaction to her arrival was a toxic cocktail of suspicion, envy, and outright condescension. She was dismissed as a movie wife, a wealthy dilettante looking for a glamorous new hobby to fill her days. The whispers in the restaurants and bars of the theater district were cruel. They said she was using her father's money or her ex-husband's money. They assumed she had no taste of her own, that she was just another bored, rich woman playing at being a producer. One prominent Broadway figure was quoted as saying, "What does a girl who grew up by a swimming pool know about real drama?" They profoundly, catastrophically underestimated her. Irene was acutely aware of the prejudice she faced, but she was not a woman who engaged in public battles. Her methods were quieter, more methodical, and far more effective. She didn't try to use her money or her connections to buy her way in. Instead, she embarked on a 2-year, self-imposed, and incredibly rigorous apprenticeship. She became a student of the theater. She saw every single play that opened on Broadway, from the biggest hits to the most obscure experimental flops. She would sit in the audience not as a glamorous celebrity, but as an anonymous, intensely focused analyst, taking notes, studying the direction, the performances, the audience's reaction. She read hundreds upon hundreds of scripts, her apartment at the Pierre becoming a library of new American and European plays. She met with everyone. She used her formidable social skills to connect with playwrights, directors, agents, set designers, and even stagehands. She wasn't networking in the Hollywood sense. She was learning. She was absorbing the culture, the language, the business, and the art of Broadway with the same analytical intensity she had once applied to David Selznick's film productions. She was, in essence, earning her degree in the trenches, and all the while, she was searching. She wasn't looking for a safe bet, a crowd-pleasing comedy that would guarantee a return on her investment. She was looking for a play that mattered. She was looking for a work of art that was bold, dangerous, and important. A project that would announce her arrival not as a dabbler, but as a producer of serious, uncompromising vision. Then one day a script landed on her desk. It had been sent to her by the legendary literary agent Audrey Wood. It was a play by one of Wood's clients, a Southern writer named Tennessee Williams. Williams was a respected poetic voice in the theater, having had a modest success with the Glass Menagerie, but he was not yet the giant he would become. The script was dark, lyrical, violent, and saturated with a kind of wounded, desperate sexuality that was unlike anything being seen on the American stage. It told the story of a faded, fragile, and mentally unstable Southern belle, Blanche Dubois, who comes to live with her sister Stella and her brutish primal brother-in-law, Stanley Kowalski, in a cramped, squalid apartment in New Orleans. The play was called A Streetcar Named Desire. Irene read the play and she was electrified. She was also terrified. It was the most brilliant, most powerful, and most profoundly human script she had ever read. But it was also a commercial producer's nightmare. Its subject matter was shocking for the time. It dealt with mental illness, alcoholism, domestic violence, and sexual assault with a frankness that was guaranteed to outrage conservative critics and much of the theater-going public. The play was claustrophobic, its ending tragic and devoid of any easy moral uplift. It was, by any conventional measure, unproducible. Several major established Broadway producers had already read Streetcar and passed on it. They recognized its literary merit but deemed it far too controversial, too depressing, and too commercially risky. But Irene saw past the risks. She understood the play's shattering poetry, its deep compassion for its broken characters, and its profound, heartbreaking commentary on the clash between the old romantic world and the brutal new realistic one. This was not just a play, it was a thunderclap. This was the statement she had been waiting to make. In an act of immense artistic courage, she decided this would be her first production. From that moment on, she became the play's fierce, meticulous, and tireless champion. She knew that a work of this power and delicacy required a perfect team. She made a series of brilliant and, in some cases, revolutionary creative decisions. For her director, she chose Elia Kazan, a dynamic, intense, and intellectually formidable figure who was at the forefront of a new psychologically realistic style of directing. Kazan was a perfect choice, but also a risky one. He was as volatile and as uncompromising as the play itself. For the central, incredibly demanding role of Blanche Dubois, Irene resisted the temptation to cast a big Hollywood star, which would have guaranteed ticket sales. Instead, she insisted on a true stage actress, a woman who could navigate the complex lyrical language and the character's terrifying emotional descent. She cast Jessica Tandy, a brilliant and respected actress, but not a household name. And then there was the role of Stanley Kowalski, the animalistic, magnetic force who destroys Blanche. It was a role that required a new kind of actor, someone with a primal, dangerous, and unapologetically sexual energy that had never been seen on the American stage before. She and Kazan began their search. And then one day, a young actor, a student of the legendary teacher Stella Adler, came into audition. He was 23 years old, broodingly handsome, and possessed a kind of mumbling, coiled intensity that was utterly mesmerizing. His name was Marlon Brando. The story of Brando's audition is the stuff of legend. He had been given money for bus fare from New York to the audition, but had spent it, so he hitchhiked. He showed up late, dressed in torn jeans, and fixed a broken toilet in the audition space before he even read. But when he finally began to read the lines, the room went silent. It was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. He wasn't acting. He was simply being. He wasn't declaiming the lines in the traditional theatrical style. He was living them with a raw, unpredictable, and electrifying realism. Kazan and Irene knew in that instant that they had found their Stanley. They had found an actor who would not just play the part, but who would ignite a revolution in the art of acting itself. The rehearsal process, which took place during the sweltering New York summer of 1947, was a crucible of brilliant, clashing, and often fragile egos. Tennessee Williams was a constant, anxious presence, terrified that his poetic vision would be compromised. Kazan was a demanding, psychologically probing director, pushing his actors to their absolute limits. And Brando was a disruptive genius, a force of nature who constantly challenged the text, his castmates, and the very process of rehearsal itself. He would show up late, he would mumble his lines, he would play practical jokes. He drove the more classically trained Jessica Tandy to distraction. Through this creative tempest, Irene was the calm, steady, and undisputed authority. She was no longer the invisible power behind the throne. She was the producer, the boss, the one who had to manage the finances, the schedules, and the personalities. She attended every rehearsal, sitting quietly in the darkened theater, taking meticulous notes. Her famous memos, once the secret fuel for David Selznick's productions, were now being sent under her own name from her own office at the Pierre. They were just as insightful and just as detailed as ever, offering sharp notes on a line reading, a piece of stage business, or a subtle shift in the lighting. She was the play's guardian, protecting Williams's text from unnecessary changes, supporting Kazan's bold vision, and patiently nurturing the revolutionary and often bewildering talent of her young star. The anticipation and skepticism leading up to the opening night were intense. The word of mouth from out-of-town tryouts was that the play was brilliant, but shocking. Many in the Broadway community were waiting for the Hollywood princess to fall flat on her face. On the night of December 3rd, 1947, at the Ethel Barrymore Theater, the curtain went up on A Streetcar Named Desire. For the next 3 hours, the audience sat in a state of stunned, hypnotic silence. When the final curtain fell on the play's devastating conclusion, that silence continued for a full, heart-stopping minute. Then the theater erupted. The applause was like a thunderclap, a roar of emotion that went on and on. The standing ovation lasted for a full 30 minutes. It was one of the most legendary opening nights in the history of the American theater. The play was an instant, sensational triumph. The critics hailed it as a masterpiece, a landmark of American drama. The production would go on to win the Pulitzer Prize and the New York Drama Critics Circle Award. Jessica Tandy became a celebrated star, and Marlon Brando overnight became the electrifying new voice of a generation, an actor who would change the very definition of his craft. And Irene Mayer Selznick, the dilettante, the movie wife, had done it. She had silenced every single one of her critics. She had taken a massive artistic and financial risk and had produced a work of enduring, revolutionary genius. It was a victory that was entirely, indisputably her own. She had stepped out of the long shadows of her father and her husband and had cast a brilliant, powerful shadow all her own. Her second act had begun, not with a whisper, but with a roar. When we left Irene Mayer Selznick, she was standing in the thunderous applause of one of the most legendary opening nights in Broadway history. With the groundbreaking success of A Streetcar Named Desire, she had done more than just produce a hit play. She had silenced her critics, redefined her own identity, and established herself as a major artistic force in the American theater. The Hollywood princess, the woman dismissed as a dilettante, was now the producer queen of Broadway. Her second act had not just begun, it was a certified smash hit. In the aftermath of Streetcar's triumph, the doors that had once been coolly closed to her were now flung wide open. She was no longer a curiosity. She was a powerhouse, besieged with scripts and proposals. But Irene was not interested in becoming a theatrical mogul like her father. She had no desire to build an empire or to run a factory. Her approach to producing was the polar opposite of the MGM studio system she had been raised in, where MGM had been about quantity. Churning out a film a week, Irene was about quality. She was a boutique producer, a connoisseur, and her taste was her trademark. She waited 3 years before mounting her next production, a testament to her meticulous patience. She chose a play that could not have been more different from the dark emotional intensity of Streetcar. In 1950, she produced Belle, Book and Candle, a witty and sophisticated romantic comedy by John Van Druten, starring the debonair Rex Harrison and his wife Lily Palmer. It was a frothy, glamorous confection about a modern-day witch who casts a love spell on a hapless publisher in Manhattan. The play was a massive commercial success, running for months and delighting audiences with its charm and elegance. With this production, Irene proved two things. First, that her success with Streetcar was no fluke, and second, that she possessed a shrewd commercial sense to match her artistic courage. She could produce a masterpiece of dark poetry, and she could produce a sparkling, money-making hit. Her final major production in 1955 would cement her reputation as a producer of rare intelligence and literary integrity. She championed The Chalk Garden, a strange, enigmatic, and beautifully written play by the British novelist Enid Bagnold. It was a complex psychological drama filled with witty, elusive language and morally ambiguous characters. Like Streetcar, it was a difficult piece, a play that many other producers had deemed too literary and uncommercial. Irene, however, fell in love with its intelligence and its elusive Chekhovian mood. The production process was famously arduous. The author, Enid Bagnold, was a brilliant but notoriously difficult collaborator, and the script went through dozens of drafts. Irene, with her long-honed skills as a story editor, worked tirelessly with Bagnold to shape the play into a cohesive and powerful drama. The result was a resounding critical success, hailed as a masterpiece of modern theater. While it was not the commercial blockbuster that Belle, Book and Candle had been, it was a triumph of taste and intelligence, and it earned a permanent place in the theatrical canon. After The Chalk Garden, Irene largely retired from producing. She had done what she had set out to do. In the space of less than a decade, with just a handful of productions, she had established a legacy as one of the most important and respected producers of her generation. She had proven to the world and to herself that her success was entirely her own. She had built her throne on Broadway, and now she was content to reign, not as a producer, but as one of the great cultural and social arbiters of her time. Irene's suite at the Pierre Hotel was more than just a home. It was an institution. It became the most important private salon in New York, the East Coast equivalent of the court she had once presided over on Summit Drive. But this court was different. It was a salon built not on the power of the motion picture industry, but on the currency of intellect, wit, and high culture. It was the place where the disparate, often warring tribes of New York society came together. The old money aristocracy of Park Avenue, the new money titans of Wall Street, the literary lions of publishing, and the brightest stars of the Broadway stage. Irene was the bridge between them all, her drawing room the neutral territory where these worlds could meet and mingle. At the center of this glittering new court was her deep, complex, and ultimately defining friendship with the writer Truman Capote. In the 1950s and 60s, Capote was a literary superstar and a social phenomenon. He was a brilliant, elfin creature with a famously sharp tongue and an insatiable appetite for gossip. He was utterly captivated by a group of supremely elegant, wealthy, and powerful society women whom he dubbed his swans. These women, Babe Paley, Slim Keith, Gloria Guinness, C.Z. Guest were his muses, his confidants, and his ultimate entree into the highest echelons of society. Irene was one of the original and most important of these swans, but she held a unique position within the flock. She was older, wiser, and more intellectual than the others. Unlike them, her identity was not solely defined by being the wife of a powerful man. She was a power in her own right, a respected professional woman. For Capote, Irene was more than just a glamorous companion. She was a maternal figure, a mentor, and one of the few people whose intelligence he truly respected. He would spend hours in her library at the Pierre, reading her his works in progress, seeking her famously sharp editorial advice. She, in turn, was fascinated by his genius, but she was also one of the few people in his inner circle who was not blinded by it. She saw his deep-seated insecurities and his capacity for self-destruction with a clear-eyed realism. Their bond was tested, as all of Capote's relationships were, by his ultimate act of social treason. In 1975, Esquire magazine published La Côte Basque, 1965, an excerpt from his long-awaited, unfinished novel, Answered Prayers. It was a thinly veiled and brutally cruel piece of fiction that exposed the most intimate, scandalous, and painful secrets of his beloved swans and their husbands. The story detailed affairs, revealed private humiliations, and even insinuated that one of his friends was a murderer. The fallout was catastrophic. It was a social atom bomb. His swans, led by the deeply wounded Babe Paley, excommunicated him instantly and permanently. He became a social pariah, cast out of the paradise he had worked so hard to enter. But Irene's reaction was different. While she was undoubtedly appalled by his cruelty and his betrayal of trust, she did not cut him off completely. Her response was not one of rage, but of a deep, profound sadness. A friend who was with her when she first read the piece recalled her putting the magazine down and saying quietly, "The bastard, the poor, brilliant bastard, he shot himself." Her reaction is a key to understanding her character. Unlike the other swans, Irene's sense of self was not dependent on the approval of high society. And having been married to David Selznick, she understood the nature of self-destructive genius better than anyone. She saw Capote's betrayal not just as an act of malice, but as a tragic, self-inflicted wound, the lashing out of a deeply unhappy man. While their intimacy was never the same, she would continue to speak to him on occasion, a quiet act of compassion that set her apart from the rest of her circle. She had seen true betrayal, true heartbreak, and she had the wisdom to recognize it in its many forms. In the years after she retired from producing, she settled into the role of an elegant elder stateswoman. She was a tireless philanthropist, serving on the boards of museums and charitable organizations. She traveled, she read, and she presided over her court at the Pierre. And then in her 70s, she embarked on her final creative act. She decided to tell her own story. For years, she had been the keeper of secrets, the silent observer, the woman who had stood at the epicenter of Hollywood's golden age. Her autobiography, A Private View, published in 1983, was an immediate sensation. It was not a tell-all, gossip-filled memoir. That was not her style. It was an elegant, intelligent, and beautifully written account of her extraordinary life, told with her characteristic discretion and sharp, unsentimental insight. She wrote with deep but clear-eyed affection for her father and her ex-husband, acknowledging their genius while never shying away from their flaws. But the most powerful story in the book was her own, the quiet, steady narrative of a woman's journey from a life of reflected glory to one of hard-won personal achievement. The book was a critical and commercial success, a final triumphant vindication She lived out her final years with the same quiet dignity that had defined her entire life, a revered and respected figure in the cultural life of New York. On September 22, 1990, Irene Mayer Selznick died peacefully in her apartment at the Pierre. She was 83 years old. Her death marked the end of a life that was, in its own way, as epic and as dramatic as any of the films she had helped to create. So as we return to Truman Capote's famous glittering phrase, Hollywood royalty lost in East Coast society, we can now see it for what it was, a brilliant observation that was in the end completely wrong. Irene Mayer Selznick was never lost. In fact, it was in the demanding intellectual world of New York that she was finally, truly found. She didn't lose a kingdom, she escaped one. She abdicated a throne that had been built for her by her father and her husband, and she crossed a continent to build a new one, a throne that was entirely, indisputably her own. Culturally, her life serves as a unique and invaluable bridge between the two great power centers of 20th century America. She was the ultimate insider in both the dream factory of Hollywood and the intellectual salon of New York. Her journey from one coast to the other is a story of the shifting cultural tides of the nation itself. In the end, Irene's story is a testament to the fact that the most important journey is the one we take from being an object in someone else's story to becoming the author of our own. She was born a princess, she was married to a king, but she found her true power only when she walked away from the palace. Her life, like the plays she so carefully produced, was a masterpiece of intelligence, integrity, and quiet, unshakable strength. She was never just Hollywood royalty. She was, in the end, simply and magnificently her own woman. And there is no grander title than that.